Uh, Brilliant. Thanks for preparing in advance. That makes my life a lot easier. Thanks for sharing the link, Eduardo. Just waiting for YouTube to catch up with us. But it always goes back to our chatting before we look live. So I'm going to get started and say welcome to Neuroccino. Slightly late this morning because we were chatting and forgot to press start. But today, Eduardo very kindly agreed to jump in and host Neuroccino today because one of our colleagues is busy today. So thank you very much for being spontaneous and preparing a paper for us this morning. And thanks for sharing the link. Whenever you're ready, just take it away.
Okay, I should be able to see my screen, I think. Yeah, okay, yeah, so I didn't have much time to prepare this Neuroccino, so I picked an historic paper, hoping it would have been easier to prepare. How delusional of me. But anyway, yeah, so the paper I want to present to you today is a really old one. And I asked Stephanie to title this Neuroccino, the true origin of neuropsychology, in a sort of a provocative way, because I think this 1825 paper by Jean-Baptiste Bouillaud is, if we really had to pick a date to sort of mark the birth of cognitive neuropsychology, that should be 1826 and not 1861, like the classic Paul Broca paper. And yeah, I'm gonna try to convince you and show you why. So a short, brief context. Jean-Baptiste Bouillaud is a French guy, of course. He was born in 1796 into the fire of revolution, and he died in 1881. He was formed very, very young by his own uncle, Jean Bouillaud, not a lot of fantasy with the names, who was a surgeon in the French army during the Napoleonic campaigns. And he later, of course, completed a formal training as a doctor, and he produced a lot of works. And as usual, back in the days, on a lot of different topics, such as pathologies of the circulatory system, on fevers, and on brain inflammations and lesions. He would become an estimated doctor and professor in Paris. And there is a noteworthy event. So his work on brain lesions will be presented later on by his son-in-law named Ernest Auburtin at a certain Society of Anthropology in 1861. Does that ring a bell? Yeah, I think Stephanie knows. So that year at the presentation at the Society of Anthropology, Paul Broca was sitting in the audience and he listened to that presentation. Also, another noteworthy stuff, maybe for another Neuroccino, Auburtin is possibly the first one I could find to perform a sort of like direct brain stimulation, so to speak, some 90 years before Wilder Penfield. In the sense that in that report in 1861, he talks about a guy who failed to kill himself, but blew off part of his skull, exposing the brain. So Auburtin, while examining this guy who was alive, reported that when pressing with a spatula on the brain, if the patient was speaking, the speech would be interrupted, and then it would come back when lifting the spatula. So yeah, but that's a story for maybe another Neuroccino. Let's go back to Jean-Baptiste Bouillaud and the 1825 paper. So this is the title. Yeah, it's in French. I think we should translate those papers sooner or later. But the title translates into clinical researches aiming to demonstrate that the loss of speech corresponds to a lesion of the anterior lobules of the brain. And to confirm the opinion of Mr. Gall on the location of the organ of the articulated language. So a first thing about the title is that, and about the paper in general, I couldn't get what he means by anterior lobules of the brain. The anatomical terminology is kind of not super clear sometimes, because I guess back in the days that would have been clear to the audience, but it's not so clear now. And like by reading through the paper, I think by anterior lobules, he means either the entire frontal lobes or the ventral inferior part of the frontal lobes. And yeah, so and the second thing about the title is that you should notice the stress on the motor functioning. So it's articulated language. It's not language per se. And this is a thing that the old papers on language have in common. They are almost all of them, they are generally about the articulation of speech rather than language itself. And that's the case because there was no clear theory of language back in the day. So people tended to focus on the articulation of speech. And if anything, language was considered as a sort of manifestation of memory somehow. But yeah, anyway, the paper has then a sort of structure. There is a brief introduction, a first part where he showed cases to sustain his hypothesis. A third part where he then discussed more in detail the methods and the theoretical background, and then a general conclusion. So the introduction, it's kind of curious because, again, so I mentioned this stress on the motor production, motor functioning, motor cognition, so to speak. And indeed, the paper started by confuting the position of Marie Florent, French physiologist, more or less at the same time. Starting by confuting his position on the influence of brain over muscle activity. So apparently, Florent had this idea that the brain does not have immediate and direct influence over the muscular activity. The brain is just dealing with some sort of like, high functioning such as will and intelligence, and so on. But yeah, Bouillaud goes on and it does confute this position by reporting how different parts of the brain apparently deal with different movements from different muscle groups. And he builds, of course, on observation from lesion study in like lesions from humans, showing like reporting how you can have, for example, a paralysis of one arm, of one leg, depending on the site of lesion. And he also reports interesting results from animal lesion studies from other researchers, other doctors, showing, for example, that they were aware, for example, that by lesioning the more lateral ventral part of the brain, they would have caused a paralysis of the anterior limb of an animal, while lesioning the more superior part of the brain, they would have caused paralysis of the posterior limbs of that same animal. So this is coherent with what we know about the topographical organization of motor cortex and the sensory motor cortex in general. So yeah, building on this framework, he says, now the brain is involved in muscular activity, and there are different districts of the brain, different organs. So he used this word, different organs in the brain dealing with different movements. And then he goes on and says, so the organs of speech then must have a special organ as well. Why? Because they can be lesioned in isolation. And that this is the liaison for the first, like the next section, like it's called the first part. Sorry, the first part was the introduction. Then this more wide discussion, whose title translates into existence of a brain center assigned to the organs of speech, proved by observations of isolated paralysis of these organs. So here, Bouillaud reports a series of 3 cases, clinical cases of patients that selectively lost the ability to produce speech. But he says they were generally able to understand what was told to them, and they could produce gestures to sort of try to communicate what they wanted to say. And this is intended to prove indeed that a selective paralysis of the speech organs is possible. And this allows to build the actual hypothesis of the main hypothesis of the entire paper. And this is that since we have a selective paralysis of the speech organs, then there must be a specific brain center dealing with these movements, with this kind of movements. And the second part, which is the largest of the most extended part of the paper, indeed goes on in trying to prove that, and to prove that it's the frontal lobe that is dealing with the production of language. So the title of this section is the brain center that presides over the movements of the organs of speech is located in the anterior lobules of the brain. And yeah, so Bouillaud is aware that there is a comparative physiology problem that we cannot study animals to study speech production. And yeah, we have to basically wait for brain lesions to occur, and we can study that. So he goes on and um, he makes two mirror predictions that must be both valid at the same time for his hypothesis to hold, namely that this center for speech control are in the frontal lobe. And the first one, if the hypothesis is true, then a lesion of the frontal lobules must produce speech paralysis. And the second, if also the hypothesis is true, then a lesion outside the frontal lobules must not produce speech paralysis. So if these two conditions are met, then the hypothesis is valid. We can go on and say, yeah, it's in the frontal lobules. And yeah, he basically does that. He goes on, he revises a couple of the previous 3 cases for which he had a post-mortem autopsy. The third patient survived, so happily. And then he reports a series of positive evidences, another series of positive evidence. So observations of, that's a later section. Yeah, so positive evidences, observations of loss or alteration of speech following a lesion of the anterior lobules of the brain. With catted shirt, there's a bunch of interesting cases for which Bouillaud reports his own and other doctors' patients that had speech paralysis and a lesion in the frontal lobules. And then there is the next section, which is later on here. Negative evidences, observations of lesion of brain parts other than the anterior lobules of the brain with conservation of speech. And this is a series of 6 negative cases. Also some of his own and some from other publicated books or articles on that. He does report the sources, so that is nice. But yeah, so it goes on to a more general, so this is like an entire list of, there is a huge list of cited cases. And then it goes on to a more general discussion. And he says this new paradigm is useful because it allows us to explain way more things that assuming that the brain is not involved specifically into speech. And he makes some general interesting conclusions, I think. Because yeah, he noticed, for example, that animals, so he hypothesized that animals do not speak, not because they don't have the organs to produce speech, but because they don't have the brain organ, like the brain organs, so that the brain areas, the brain networks, we will say today, to produce language and speech. It's not just a matter of interface. He also noticed that children do not speak, but for example, they can move their mouth, their tongue, their throat, for example, they can swallow. And this happens because the movements that contribute to speech production must be educated first, as they belong more to like a sort of higher cognition plan and not to basic functions. And yeah, patients that lose the articulation of speech are still able to think and express their thoughts in some other ways. And in this point, I think Bouillaud gets really, really close to hypothesizing that speech production might just be a sort of interface between the brain and the articularity organs, for example. And yeah, there's a later mentioning of Franz Gall and his own work, where he sort of like debate and confirm partially. Here there is the closest things to a definition of language that I could find, which is like to create symbols of our ideas and maintain them into memory. So again, this is more like a memory theory of a language, which is still separated from the production of language. And yeah, he says, I'm not sure whether the frontal lobules are hosting just the production or the entire language, but we are sure for the production. So the conclusion, which is the last short section, just wrap up, and there are some yeah, just sort of summarizing what I tried to explain to you. Mainly the brain is involved in any kind of motor activity. There are multiple motor organs for different motor tasks. The production of speech is one of the tasks, and it's regulated by a specific organ. And this organ is in the frontal lobules. So, and there are like a bunch of other like secondary conclusions. So to conclude and to open the discussion, it's an old paper, so a lot of the stuff that it's in here, it's of course no longer valid, but I think it's an important methodological and theoretical paper for one reason, because it allowed to do more research and to do it within a solid paradigm, which is the one of localization, which back in the days was still something really new and really advanced. And with solid tools, the anatomo-clinical double dissociation. Double is the key word. And this provided, for example, Pompoca for a lens through which he could understand what was happening to Louis Victor Leborgne, his patient, when he saw him. So in a sense, that's why I think this paper is actually should be considered as a really important paper, as a sort of a starting point of clinical cognitive neuropsychology, because the Broca didn't discover anything in a certain sense. That's important because the Broca's paper is important, but for another reason, and it is important because Broca found what he was expecting to find, and he could do that because he knew this work. He was aware of Jean-Baptiste Bouillaud work, and yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. I would have liked to be a little bit shorter, but yeah.
That's
So
fine. Thank you very much.
questions.
Also quite a strong statement. Broca didn't discover anything to
Yeah, but that's the important
finish on
part.
that. But also to be fair, like Broca is the one who put it together and dare to say, well, actually, he said, I do not dare to say.
Yeah.
But there's also the Duxes, for example, that collected a lot of cases. So I guess what's important about the particular paper that you presented today is that it's one of the first, I guess today we would call it large data set, because he managed to amass about 500 patients, I think, over his lifespan. But also he wasn't the first or the last to do it, just to put it into perspective. Hands are up. Chris, take it away.
So first, did you read the whole thing in French and or did you have to translate?
Yeah. Well, I read it in French, and then I translated like the titles of the sections for you to have some context.
But so you were able to read the whole thing?
Yeah.
Your mastery of French is insane, because how it's written, it's mad.
Yeah, it's not super easy.
It's just crazy.
The anatomical terms are really messed up sometimes.
Yeah,
Then
but even like how the sentences are to explain the things, it's so convoluted. It's
yeah.
insane. Yeah, just so that means that some researchers today are using a model of language in the brain that will be 200 years old in 2 years.
Yes, in 1 year actually. It's
I
next
use
year. Yeah.
it's 25. Ah,
25. Yeah.
okay, I thought it was 26.
I mean,
Yeah, but yeah,
that's it's a
it's
couple of
pretty bad.
centuries. So yeah, that's basically it.
And because yeah, it's localizationism, but it's understandable 200 years ago,
Yeah, 200
maybe
years
less
ago,
so
I think
now.
it was a big step forward, especially when you had the people such as Florent saying, yeah, no, it's like the brain is just a sort of electrochemical jelly doing whatever. There is no localization. Each area could do anything. I mean, at that point this is interesting. Like some of the observations are really smart, and we should keep in mind that at that point in history, people were not even aware that neurons existed. So
Yeah.
That was the neurons, I think it was like 1870s where Golgi observed them for the first time. So there is even this tendency of describing the brain as a set of organs because, yeah, I mean, they couldn't know better.
Yeah, it's a bit sad that some models didn't evolve for 200 years.
But he's also part of the, or used to be part of the phrenology school, right? So Gall was before him, who already placed speech and language in the frontal lobes vaguely.
Yeah. So I think the merit of Jean-Baptiste Bouillaud is to take the phrenology, whatever theory, and make it not ridiculous and actually back it up with some evidence and some theoretical tools. So this is the first description I can find of the double anatomo-clinical dissociation. So like observing one lesion in one point and a certain functional deficit and not for lesions in other places on the brain. This is the first description, like fully formed that I'm aware of. I don't know if
There was descriptions before. It even goes back to ancient Egypt, where
no, yeah, I mean, but
the
of
association between a stroke, a brain lesion, and changes in behavior. But he really brought in the
but
amount of data to associate.
Yeah, but also the strong claim that you must observe a certain lesion and with a part and not not a lesion in another part of the brain. Yeah, I can't find anything like that before, not with such a level of awareness about the limitations of the observations, if anything. I think Hervé has a...
Yes, thank you, Eduardo. So yes, a French article. So that is the first. It's more a comment that than it's rather a comment than a question. So if you go to page 42, I was just reading the conclusion. It's interesting how these articles give historical context of neuroscience research. Yes, so if you see the beginning of the first, this paragraph is interesting because what they say is that they are surprised that patients with a deficit in language have still the function of having ideas, emotions. So you see that they don't. Intelligence is intricated with the language, and they cannot think that if you lose language, you can still have ideas, you can still think, you can still have intelligence. So that was it was surprising to have this sentence here where they are really amazed that people that don't speak still can have some intelligence. So
yeah, I skipped over this part a little bit for the sake of time, but yeah, it's true. It's really interesting because he gets really close to the first differentiations of different parts of language. So it's just language production. It's not intelligence. It's not thinking. It's probably not even language per se, because these people, I guess, by the way he describes the patients, they can still speak in their own mind, but they are not able to express themselves. So yeah, and there's some observations on signing and gesturing that are really interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think it's the very same paragraph. I basically describe the speech as an articulated gesture, which is kind of close to saying signing, speaking, no big deal. It's just an interface to the outside world.
Which is quite a modern take, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
More modern than some localizationist theories.
Muge has a question.
Yeah, hello. Thanks, Eduardo. I have a practical question, not a controversial one, but a really practical. So you mentioned that about the animal lesioning studies. So I'm curious, like, what kind of animal models do they use, and how do they do the lesioning with the animals?
Yeah, okay, good question. I'm gonna run by just figure out by own memory. So he mentioned the works of Pierre Florent, this guy he mentioned here in the first few lines. And if I remember correctly, he used to work on pigeons. That's why if you look at this guy's work, methodologically, it's really neat. But since he was working on pigeons and then making, assumptions on humans, then, that doesn't match. So the conclusions are completely wrong, but the methods are generally fine. And maybe for so you mentioned also other people doing this kind of physiological comparative studies, but it does not mention the animals. Yeah, so these certain
He used a lot of chicken and dogs.
Yeah, dogs was also a big thing back in the days. I mean, Pavlov. And
like I'm wondering if they had like specific like animal facilities to breed like I don't know animal models.
It's a long time ago, so
or
it's like ethical
catch the pigeons
constraints
outside. Yeah.
I don't know, but yeah, so my educated guess will be birds, like pigeons, chickens, and dogs, mostly.
Yeah.
I do remember like there were people doing experiments with primates like in the early 20th century, but
It's more
this is even before Darwin, so it's it's already extraordinary that they had comparative physiology, to my mind, because there were theories sort of like this is not Darwin is not the first one to describe a sort of like evolution like theory, but still.
That's something I'm curious about, because certain fields like focus on specific animal models, like in the vision, for example, neuroscience, vision research, it's usually the cats. But like back in those days, they didn't even have a lot of idea about evolution, like primates, and what, I don't know, like if you're studying speech and language, what would be the most relevant animal models back in those days? But I guess they didn't have a very strong opinion on that. Just whatever animal they could find.
I guess the take was different, right? Because they were more interested in the mechanisms behind it. And then it doesn't really matter what kind of model you take if you want to understand if you lesion this part, is there a degeneration or is there a knock-on effect? So you can test the mechanism in other species.
But for Florent, I'm sure he worked on pigeons and maybe other animals. And for these other people, so Serre, Fauville, and Pinel, he does not just say animals, but he mentioned stuff about anterior limbs and posterior limbs. So I think it's a mammal and not a big enough mammal. So something, it's not human, but something you can... He does describe this finding and reporting this anterior to posterior division of the limb paralysis according to the site of lesion in the brain, which does match our knowledge of how the motor cortex is organized. So I'm assuming somehow it's a mammal or something like that.
Okay. Thank you.
It was also long before the time of imaging, right?
Yeah, you had to wait for your patient to die and just open the skull, and still no neuroimaging. You just have to look at it. So the description of the lesion is interesting because it just the brain is a little bit softer here. There's a blood infiltration there. There's no distinction between the gray and the white matter. So these must be the focus of the lesion. Sometimes there are like tumors, so it's easier to spot, but yeah.
That's still a very accurate description of a lesion.
Yeah, no, the descriptions are really clever and really nice. So yeah, we should translate them, and maybe some German works as well.
I hear you volunteering to do the job.
No, it was just suggested to the one German native speaker in the audience. Oh, no, two, sorry. It's not for you, Muget.
Philip has a question too.
Yeah, just one question. Thank you for the presentation, Eduardo. You obviously like historic papers. I just wanted to ask you, how difficult was it for you to find this paper? Did you have to sift through a lot of like historic papers? I don't have any clue, any idea how many publications are there from this period. So I was just curious.
Yeah, that's it wasn't that difficult to find, because if you read the broadcast paper, then you find the citation. It's really there. Broca mentions the session where Ernest Aubertin reported his own and his uncle work. So yeah, if you're speaking about the copy, like to find it now, the link I sent it into the chat. It's from an MPI repository, linking to the paper, to the PDF, and there is quite some of those papers. I think it's open. I think you don't need to register or anything, log in. But yeah, those papers, some of them, like for the French ones, there is usually some public repository where you can find them. You can find the Broca's paper, you can find this one, you can find the Pierre Méry, you can find the Gérine. There's a lot of old stuff that has been digitalized, and it's maybe not immediately available, but you shouldn't go through more than a couple of Google pages to find something. Yeah, otherwise, I don't know. Yeah, but yeah, it's not immediate, but it's not super difficult. So if you want to trace the story, it's pretty doable. It's ranging from 100 to 200 years ago. It's a long time ago, but it's also not that long time ago.
Very good. Right, perfect. Thank you, Eduardo.
Yes, so if you're interested in the history, this is a very good hang on, where's the camera? Reference book.
Seems very long.
So I recommend that one if you want to find out about the historical origins of neuroscience. Right, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much also for spontaneously preparing quite a dense paper over the weekend.
To take a pause from this.
And then I look forward to seeing Hervé present next week. And don't forget that this week we have a CNS talk on Wednesday at 4 p.m. on fetal MRI brain imaging. So that's going to be super interesting. Do join us for that. And until then, have an exciting week in science. Bye.